Hi guys, my name is Ricky Ray and I'm going to read a lecture for you today entitled Identity Earth. It's a lecture about ecological awareness and animism, and it's a lecture about the fact that we're not only inhabitants of the earth, we're movements of the earth itself, and we're as responsible to the earth and her health as we are to our own health and ourselves. I spent about a decade researching this lecture, a couple of years thinking about it, and the last 2 weeks writing it nonstop. So I hope you enjoy it, and let's get going. Identity Earth, a radically abbreviated life history. The story of the Earth, and thus the story of ourselves, begins 14 billion years ago, when the universe was a young whippersnapper of pointillism, a nothingness is everything in which all stars and galaxies, all mysteries and eventualities were concentrated in a single dot. Trillions of degrees hot, it exploded and flared forth, creating the universe and commencing the grand symphony we call existence. All planets, all lives, all stories and beings began their unthinkably long journey through the womb of becoming, whose phenomena to this day continue to emerge in an unbroken process of revelation, a process so precise that if the rate of expansion had been a millionth of a percent slower, the universe would have collapsed. And if it had been a millionth of a percent faster, the universe would have exploded too quickly for structures to form, yielding nothing but dust upon dust. Instead, this miraculous creativity began to conduct itself. In one brushstroke, galaxies formed. In another, density waves passed through the Milky Way, squeezing atoms until they fused and ignited our ancestral stars. The stars blazed until they were spent, collapsed into supernovas, and exploded, much like the universe itself, with the force of 100 billion stars, forming the elements and filling in the periodic table all at once. The elements then dispersed and the cycle repeated until one day, nearly 10 billion years after the first stroke, the sun, the light bearer of our solar system, emerged, and around it a series of planets, 4 of them gaseous, too big to be solid, too small to be stars, 4 of them rocky, 3 of them solid, 1 not quite solid or liquid, neither too hot nor too cold, a rare confluence of circumstances ripe for a particular kind of development, a molten planet, its heavy elements sunk to the center, the lighter elements drifted to the mantle, and the crust, only 10 to 50 miles thick, its one solidity, rested atop these continual movements. Earth, then, fire within, shifting land, flowing waters, breath of wind, sunlight pouring through, the interwoven layers of lithosphere, hydrosphere, pedosphere, and atmosphere coalescing to comprise the ecospheric whole. Now, let us zoom in on baby Earth, whose first billion years were truly volatile, collisions both introducing water to the planet and vaporizing the oceans, which slowly returned to land over impossibly long reigns. Radiation, fire, rock, and gas ruled the day, volcanoes spewing carbon to form the atmosphere harboring warmth, and the Earth, whose creativity was born of the stars, already busy with her lifelong work of synthesis. From inorganic molecules and her inherent talent for patterning, she conjured the first spark. Single-celled organisms that replicated, spread out in vast blankets of microbial slime, and made perhaps their largest contribution, opening the doors. From the single cell streamed the whole parade of organisms. The cells merged, photosynthesized, respirated, and complex life was on its way. The Earth, like the universe, increasing in complexity, proficiency, and depth, developing the ability to store light and feed on it, to draw in breaths of air. In her creature, she became not only animate, but conscious, sentient, intelligent, discerning through the perceptual faculty that inheres in even the most basic unit of life, the cell, Her creation she nurtured and nourished, self-regulating her climate over the course of 4 billion years, even though the sun's temperature increased 25% during that time. Always nudging herself and her children onward, she was creative and protective, even when pushed to the point of annihilation, a point that nearly snubbed her precious mode of life at least a handful of times. Her story she preserved in the geological record. Crack that tone, and we learn that the Earth's crust opens up and the volcanoes spew their carbon, which traps heat, and her constituents sequester it to maintain equilibrium. The carbon in the air acidifies the rain. The acidic rain weathers the rocks. The rocks slide into the seas, and the sea dwellers drink this carbon-rich broth until they sink to the bottom, where carbon enters its well-earned slumber. Then the seafloor swallows the rock, which melts, and volcanoes spew again. Land dwellers, too, the plants, those prodigies who learn to eat light, drink the carbon from the air and cool the planet down. They die and store their riches in the ground. So it goes, volcanoes, rocks, and organisms heating up and cooling off the atmosphere, shaping the climate. And trading places. How fitting that rock, which helps give rise to life, keeps record of its movements, that it becomes one of the Earth's tongues with its own tale of her to tell. The continents move to and fro across the globe like pieces of a self-assembling puzzle, a puzzle that has no final form, just arrangements to try out, arrangements that nonetheless lend themselves to development, the configurations building one upon another. Continents collide and ocean floor becomes mountain peak, offers rock to weather. The mountains reduced to fertile plains from which the creatures take their nourishment. Supercontinents gather and dissemble. Pangaea was not the first. Its precursor, Gondwana, gathered Africa, South America, Australia, Antarctica, India, and Arabia around the South Pole, which was, for a time, tropical. But when the planet overcooled and the glaciers piled ice a mile thick, the creatures had no equatorial land to which they could escape, so they perished. The rock recorded their tale and the puzzle split, reassembling in Pangaea, with Panthalassa its single ocean, the Atlantic not yet born. Pangaeans likewise lived and died and put their carbon to bed, this time ending in fire, which Robert Frost said he preferred. Me, I'm not so sure. Again, the puzzle opened and rearranged, this time landing on a life-favoring configuration, landmass stretching pole to pole, across which the creatures could range according to temperament and need. Too hot, head poleward. Too cold, congregate at the equator. You know you found your home when your flesh and the atmosphere comply. Turn the page, and the annals of biology hold their own intrigue. We start with sponges, 500 million years ago, down in the deeps, filtering the seas, burying carbon. These and other creepy crawlies oxygenated the oceans and set the stage for life's explosion, an explosion that triggered the extinction of their predecessors via new behavior, sight, eating of other organisms, biological impact to habitat. But though the predecessors died, ocean life was off and running, and like the continents would ebb and flow in concert with the tides and skies for 100 million years. But the land was calling, and eventually the plants went ashore, and fish followed, lobed fins like legs, likely escaping predators and seeking prey. That tentative step dawned the lineage in which we find ourselves, a lineage in which crocodiles ruled before dinosaurs, some like tigers with scales, others like croc dogs, until the planet snuffed them too, and the dinosaurs arose, reigning as the apex predator for 200 million years, a species whose descendants, the birds, still outnumber mammals 2 to 1. In some ways, this world is still more theirs than ours. Then, a comet shot the dinos and opened up a niche for the creatures that populate our lives and minds. Whales, bats, butterflies, pigs, cats and horses, deer, giraffes, and bears. The Earth carried on, continually refining and adapting her life-bearing systems over time, storing her memories of past events and response mechanisms in DNA, coding creatures far before programmers entered the picture. Testing, learning, creating new organisms and new modes of consciousness within bands of possibility that allowed not only survival, but flourishing and evolution, increasing in complexity, enriching her existence. The one in which apes arrived 14 million years ago gave rise to hominids, who in turn prepared modern humans, a latecomer of the last 200,000 years who lived and foraged, loved and hunted, and crossed into America 15,000 years ago. What they found was something that would beggar belief today. Mammoths, camels, sloths that stood 15 feet, armadillos that weighed a ton, beavers the size of bears. They found native horses, zebras, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, lions bigger than their African cousins, the bones of which can still be found near downtown LA. If it isn't apparent yet, let me state it plainly. Humans arose within the earth, are of the earth, will be from embryo to faint impression in the geological record, the very earth herself. We are emergent properties of an ecological entity, a planetary being who's both life-bearing and life-preserving, and more than that, she's life-living. No earthly life occurs save in her, though life is but one of the ways in which she moves. Her ecosystems are intricate, holistic dances of organic and inorganic phenomena, the soil, water, and air inviting, eating, drinking, breathing creatures into her existence, creatures who enrich her beyond comprehension. Trillions of us contributing to an unbroken chain of experience and awareness, her creativity ever increasing and evolving, predator and prey pushing one another to be better dancers in the chase, romance shaping better seducers and reproducers in the allure, passion pressing flesh into more abundant and beautiful flesh, maternal care ripening into deeper and lengthier bonds until in us we recognize mother's lifelong tending, and who knows how deep the bonds can go in species yet to come. It is by her that we breathe, and by her being that we find ourselves here, enmeshed in terrestrial love. Further still, it is in the precise balance of her ecosystems that our life flourishes or disappears, that all life flourishes or disappears. The health of the soil and the health of the water and the health of the air are inseparable from one another and from the health of the creatures who take their nourishment from these matrices. The health of an individual and of a species and of all species is a function of our ecosystem's ability to maintain us. It should be clear then that the maintenance of these systems, systems that have taken billions of years of unimaginably complex processes to prepare and refine, is of the highest order of importance if we place value upon our lives and upon the continuity of life itself. It should be clear, too, that as we learn of the human body's need for balance through sickness, so we learn of an ecosystem's need for balance through illness, the symptoms of which are biodiversity loss and landscape degradation. If the land is sick, so will be the creatures who drink its milk, and every single living creature drinks its milk. So let us look at where we are today. We humans, from primates, from fish, from photosynthesis, from water, from mineral, from light, from stardust, emerge, and we begin to feel, to think, to speak, to dream, to communicate. We begin to extend the genetic code into the cultural code of language, architecture, agriculture, engineering, philosophy, and art. Practical and enjoyable, preserving the earth's history and wisdom in stories to be passed by mouth, and then by cultural artifact, coding her advances not only in our offspring, but in artwork and writing, the earth pushing her intimacy with and understanding of herself to new heights through us, burgeoning via self-amplifying loops of recursion and breakthrough into depths previously unexplored. coding that even turns back through culture toward DNA in the form of genetic modifications, altering her landscape, her rivers, her growing patterns, her seeds, developing the scientific method and coming to understand her patterns and properties with ever deepening penetration and accuracy. And yet, even the earth takes missteps in her grand project of life. For this species is forgetful, myopic, negligent, dangerous, deceitful, arrogant, delusional, even malevolent. We're a geomorphic force capable of wreaking havoc upon the planet and its beautiful, miraculous array of living kingdoms and life-bearing landscapes, as has happened only a handful of times. So where are we now? How do we conceive of ourselves? What do we believe in? How do we treat one another as people and as species? How do we behave? How do we feel? How do we educate? How do we contribute to the health of our species, our ecosystems, and our Earth? I don't like the answers to these questions. I can already feel them coming and darkening the room, but they urgently need, nay, demand answering with as ruthless and an unwavering of a conscience as we can apply. The life of a million species is on the line, and even that may be a gross underestimate. But before I offer my view of our present standing, let me say that when I use the term we, I fully implicate myself in every condemnable behavior that I implore and many more. I speak not for others, but as a member of the species and of our general membership. I speak as the species itself and as the integral animate earth whose conscience pervades ours. I'm giving her a voice in my voice and trying to hear what she has to say. We hold ourselves as either the nexus of evolution or God's chosen species, the special children, somehow above, superior, and apart. We take credit as if we are our own originators, our own authenticators, our lives the lives of supreme importance, our minds the ultimate adjudicators of value, our senses the final arbiters of purpose and worth. We converse as if we were merely inhabitants of the earth, as if nature were something other, as if the earth and its creatures were put here for our use, dominion, and pleasure, as if the earth were a mostly inert backdrop for human affairs, a passive lump of resources for us to utilize and demolish at will, as if our only limits were the limits of our imaginations and desires, as if political and economic will were the ruling bases of existence, as if an ethos of individualism and infinite progress had no bearing upon a holistic being and her finite sources of nourishment upon which life itself depends. We act, consciously or not, as if we were an invasive species put here to exert human control over the planet and use it as a means for self-pleasure. The earth and its creatures to be tossed aside when we deem them no longer satisfactory, as if at that point we could fire up our starship and head on over to the next inhabitable planet for human hedonism part 2. Never mind that this worldview is full of inconsistencies, potholes, and outright derangements. Never mind that we ourselves are creatures born of and living within the animate earth, and that our ability to survive is entirely dependent upon her ability to generate and sustain new life. Never mind that our very being and all of our worth and value, our desires and pleasures, our intimacies and communions are derived from and comprised of her. Never mind that we ourselves are secondary to life, tertiary to earth, derivative of her creativity, that she is the originator of our specimens, that she is the authentic identity in whom our nature and manifestation briefly flare forth. Never mind that we are the earth before, during, and after our brief sojourn as human, that we are fauna in her inner biome, and could no more dispense with her than we could dispense with ourselves. Even if we could leave the planet, we wouldn't just be humans leaving the planet. We would be the Earth becoming more than a single celestial body in space, just as she formed the moon of her lighter elements in an earlier instance of adaptation. We can ignore the continuity of being to which we belong. We can ignore the source and substance of our identity. We can even ignore the subtle general degradation of our terrain, but we can't ignore the consequences of our actions when they threaten our very existence. I'm not sure that's true. I think we're quite capable of ignoring even that, but given that our conscience is also the Earth's, it seems that she will only allow this willful ignorance and destruction to be pushed so far. This pervasive and already deeply damaging ethos that amounts to alienation and wanton destruction in the pursuit of pleasure, property, and power is, on many fronts, being shown its monstrous face in the ecological mirror. Looking at this face in the mirror is, and should fucking well be, scary. But who is that beast in the mirror? How did we become this ghastly thing that shocks itself with its own manner and appearance? And if we trace those missteps, if the earth in us acknowledges her mistakes, if we take a full accounting with heart and whatever we're able to muster of empathy and benevolence, can we correct our errors? Can we stem the tide? Can we look in the mirror and once again recognize the beautiful, healthy life force that wants to love and sing? I think so. I don't know to what extent. Perhaps we can radically transform ourselves as we have been transformed, or perhaps we can only make small momentary improvements until some external condition forces our hand. But whatever the case, I think that an honest self-assessment and critique, a compassionate but clear-eyed interrogation of our achievements, actions, and beliefs is one of the first and most important steps we can take. We know the good and bad we've done to ourselves and one another. Now it is time to consider our ecological crimes and contributions. To take a long, hard look at what we've done to our fellow creatures, what we've done to our land, our skies, our seas, our planetary being, our home. We've built a civilization that is primarily driven on taking the carbon capital from the earth and pumping it into the air as fast and as furiously as possible, lining our pockets and pressing the oversized button of our pleasure centers manically as we go. We've leveled the seven kingdoms to the point where the total land animal biomass is only 3% wildlife and 97% human pets and livestock. We've leveled habitats by converting half the Earth's arable land to farms, employing short-sighted agricultural practices that have ruined civilizations from the Mesopotamians to the Mayans. We've extinguished 90% of large ocean predators since 1950 and 40% of marine life overall. A whopping 75% of the total earthly terrain has been severely altered by human impact, with an estimated 47% loss in ecosystem health. That's right, the Earth is 47% less healthy than she was before we got here. These damages and losses are accelerating and expanding by the day, and if the human population continues upon its current trajectory, we would need several more Earths for our descendants to enjoy anything resembling a developed nation's quality of life. The worst statistic? 1 million species stand to be murdered into extinction over the coming decades, and our horror movie future makes COVID-19 look like a mildly unpleasant picnic. Droughts, floods, famines, extreme weather events, mass refugee migrations, recurring and worsening pandemics, food chain collapse, and the kicker, death. It's no wonder we stick our heads in the sand, but how did we get here? Clearly, we didn't wake up one day and say, let's see how much havoc we can wreak. The causes are myriad and manifold and include issues of language, identity, belief, education, agriculture, religion, science, technology, and politics. But they all fall under the umbrella terms of alienation and domination, which are two symptoms of the same cause. If we see ourselves as removed from our earthly body, if our focus remains on our person and our species, if we rarely ever stop to consider our wider existence, then the cries and warnings of our ecosphere seem distant, otherworldly, hardly worthy of recognition. a conclusion that's evident everywhere in our culture, in climate science denial, in calls for unabated population growth and economic progress, as though a doctrine of infinite growth, coupled with a living matrix of finite sources, were a recipe for anything but ruin. No, we didn't get here all at once. We arrived moment by moment, thought by thought, action by action, civilization by civilization. And I think tracing the various developments and errors that led us here will help us to not only better understand ourselves and our predicament, but to comprehend alternate lifeways and to consider potential life-saving alternatives ahead. We start with the mouth, with perhaps our greatest source of creativity and our most potent intoxicant, human language. As we named things and drew the connections between them, as we became increasingly familiar with the earth and dreamed new paths into her, we became adept at articulating our experiences amongst ourselves, an interaction that served both as a means of self-expression and a means of developing social structures and bonds. But we weren't the only species talking. No, the whole world was alive, filled with conversant creatures and phenomena, animate entities who communicated in a language native to their bodies and symbiotically shaped one another's understanding and evolution. The trees spoke to the birds, the ocean spoke to the fish, the rivers spoke to the canyons. Weather, worry, and affection spoke to us all. And we listened and spoke back. We spoke to the entities that gave us our minds, our tongues, and speech, aware that we were alive in a worldwide conversation, that language was what everything spoke by the mere fact of its being, that embodiment meant communication. But somewhere along the way, we began to tune these voices out. We began to regard speech as a purely human province, a belief that impoverished our exchanges, hollowing out the polyphony of sensual existence, draining us not only of this wider music, but of understanding and of health. And then we invented writing. Our focus on the written word further embedded us in an increasingly stale, self-referential loop in which only human voices had any say. Even worse, the realm of signs and signifiers divorced the wisdom we sought to preserve from its place-specific context. This both enabled us to imagine ourselves as the origins of language rather than the ecosystems that shaped us, and removed us from the experiential framework in which the wisdom arose. It made language an abstract interiority, not a mode of interchange with the wider world, and it codified wisdom in static axioms, preventing us from shedding outmoded ideas and engaging in a collective learning process as adaptive and responsive as our animal senses, as our ecological bodies. It made us regard the tongue and book as the sources of wisdom, rather than merely the mediums via which the wisdom spread. From the mouth and the book, we move to the land. Agriculture, a recent development of the last 10,000 years, was another giant leap, a cultural revolution in which we transitioned from hunter-gatherers to stationary fixtures, divorcing our sensibilities from the patterns of migration. Living in one place was convenient, yes, and it offered a sense of security that was lacking on the move, a chance to build larger social hierarchies and to develop a relationship with a plot of earth entrusted to our care. But that care depended upon our outlook, for the shift also opened up in us the ability to think of the human-earth relationship as one of ownership rather than one of mutual support and compliance, and one of continual demand in which we depleted the soils until they could no longer reproduce. So we grew poor and malnourished or moved on, repeating the mistake again and again, leaving the land barren in our wake, a mistake we continue to make on a massive scale today, turning fertile soils into deserts and filling oceans with dead zones, once thriving ecosystems now inhospitable to life. As Wendell Berry said, the condition of the people is indistinguishable ultimately from the condition of the land. The same holds true for life. Another byproduct of agriculture was increased leisure time, which meant increased opportunity for invention. The invention of a tilling plow allowed us to grow far more than was needed to feed ourselves, to disregard natural limits and the give and take exchanges of sufficiency that were integral to maintaining health. Our relationship with the land shifted from one based on the needs of the family to one based on the power of the plow. We took more than we needed, used the surplus for economic gain, and the capitalist ethic of exploitation took its first foul breaths, the manic gleam in its eyes foreshadowing the ruthless monster it would become. By then, the seeds of alienation and domination were well planted, but in the next step they would race across the globe like a life-choking invasive species. That step, religion. On one level, the error begins as a matter of focus, specifically a focus on the human. If religion arose to serve humanity, can it be blamed for having an anthropocentric focus? I don't think blame helps our inquiry, but I think religion did reinforce the focus with disastrous consequences. The Abrahamic traditions taught us that we were God's children, the chosen species, instilling a sense of superiority, of being over and above other creatures, even over and above nature. They taught us that the creatures and terrain were put here for our use, dominion, and pleasure, instilling further a sense that in the hierarchy of living systems, we were at the top and the earth was here to serve us, not the other way around. They contextualized the earth as the raw set of resources from which we could create and conduct human affairs, rather than as the ecological entity in whose creativity we are embedded, and whose evolutionary and organizational properties far exceed our own. They and other religious traditions also turned us against the pleasures and difficulties of the physical world, shaping spirituality as an interior rather than exterior pursuit. For salvation was to be found within, where the soul, that divine spark, resided, not without, where the lowly creatures and dumb earth suffered for want of grace. Enlightenment was also to be found within, where our true nature resided, not without, where the illusory nature of the 10,000 things tempted us to believe in a material reality. Religion posited a soul, then it divorced it from the body as something beneath the soul's station, something awareness merely inhabited, setting up the belief that both flesh and earth were beneath us, filthy temptations to endure while we awaited transcendent heights. Religion bred in us a thirst for transcendence, a thirst in which we failed to notice, and in some cases outright rejected the intuition that, by being the earth, who developed life within herself, we were already more than life. We were by nature, not by appeal to some hidden deity, transcendent, and would continue on in her and as her long after our current form subsided into life's marvelous thriving. Maybe this intuition helped give rise to the notions of soul and heaven, but without our lastingness being centered in our celestial body, the notions, in concert with the beliefs of superiority and dominion, were ingredients ripe for a culture of disregard, neglect, and abuse of every layer of that body, from our own fleshly instruments to our fellow creatures and landscapes to the entire animate earth. I think these beliefs were less the product of intention than misperception and misguidance in ourselves and in our relation to authority. Religion had a keen sense of the development of the human as a being within the human community, and even structured rituals around the seasonal cycles. But it was lacking in understanding of the evolution of the species, let alone the evolution of the cosmos. The awareness was lacking in their cosmologies and morals, and therefore lacking in their bases of belief. And once we codified the traditions in writing and held these static, place-removed texts as divine authorities, once we took the word as a specifically human trait and projected that word into the mouth of an anthropomorphic deity, is it any wonder that we rejected and ignored the authority of the voices around us? Once we told ourselves that we were in this world but not of it, is it any wonder that we led ourselves astray, that we authored a creation story in which an apple, the fruit of the earth, was our downfall? So far, we've seen how language, writing, agriculture, and religion converge to deepen our alienation and domination, but it wasn't until the time of the Industrial Revolution that we really went off the rails. A point in time supercharged by three closely aligned developments in the human narrative: the scientific revolution of the 16th century, the philosophical enlightenment of the 17th century, and the industrial revolution of the 18th century. These three developments, driven in part by the bases of belief in humanity as a superior, dominant, divinely ordained species, would converge to radically alter the course of humankind, the face of the planet, and life as we know it. It was perhaps our greatest blessing and our greatest curse. The ecological impact of the scientific revolution gained traction with a notion popularized by Francis Bacon that we, as humans, were, quote, the minister and interpreter of nature, and that by intimately studying her via the processes of experiment and rational investigation, we could learn how to exert our power over her, how to, quote, conquer and subdue nature, shake her to her foundations, and impose a new nature, end quote, upon our earthly experience. This level of mastery and control, this subjugation of the earth such that she accorded to our design, not us to hers, was, quote, the labor and aim of human power, end quote, i.e., the true pursuit of human endeavors. Descartes seized upon this split and posited a bifurcation between both man and nature and mind and body, citing the former as the masters and possessors of the latter, igniting a philosophical dualism that entrenched itself so deep into the human psyche. We still orient ourselves along these lines of separation today. Who among us hasn't thought of our mind as something other than our body, and who among us hasn't thought of nature as the rough pasture that begins at the end of civilization? This Cartesian duality heavily influenced scientific thinking by separating the observer from the observed, subjectivity pertaining to the former, objectivity to everything else. It also prompted science to advance an intensely reductionist and mechanistic worldview, conceiving of the world as reducible parts, masterable components rather than integral symbiotic wholes. By and large, scientific disciplines have focused on the human to nature perspective, often neglecting, until the subversive science of ecology came along, the nature to human perspective, the holistic awareness now awakening us to our existential position of membership, cooperation, and compliance, or else. I don't mean to imply that the scientific method is at fault, but as the ecologist Stan Rowe said, science is a cultural pursuit rooted in our Western philosophical tradition. It has been harnessed to human goals in its traditional agenda, hidden because unquestioned, has been service to humanity, no matter what the costs to the rest of creation. We have used it, religion, agriculture, philosophy, and writing to serve human interests over everything else. That intense self-interest gave rise to another of our catastrophically short-sighted philosophies, individualism. One of its originators, John Locke, cared deeply for the common man's experience within the often brutal realities of political life, and he believed passionately in our inherent good nature. For these reasons and more, he established the political individual as prior to and more important than society, arguing that people had the liberty to do anything they pleased and would use reason to prevent themselves from doing harm. Attempting to protect the citizen, Locke inadvertently emphasized the worth of the individual to such an extreme that human desires and unchecked liberties were held to be of greater value than not only political systems, but everything else. An argument for human rights hypocritically became the default justification for an almost total disregard of the ecological consequences of our actions, though the fulfillment of personal desire were of utmost importance, greater in worth even than the integrity of an ecosphere that has generated and supported trillions of lives over billions of years. And so, finally, We have before us the full list of ingredients that, when placed into the combustive engine of the Industrial Revolution, would push us over the edge and wreak havoc upon our fellow creatures, the land, the skies, the seas, and the precious nervous system of the planet. Our use of language and writing in the attempt to extract ourselves from the earth's bosom, our use of religion and philosophy to proclaim superiority and dominion, our use of science and agriculture to exert our considerable influence within our ecosystems, and our use of individualism and earth-given ability to practice a hedonistic pursuit of wealth, liberty, and pleasure. All this funneled into burgeoning advances in technology that would enable us to split open the earth, explode the population, plunder the earth's various stores of natural capital, and commit widespread ecocide under the doctrine of infinite progress. Tack on the digital revolution, we've entrenched ourselves in anthropocentrism to the point that we seem to have two worlds, the world of our creation and the world of intolerable weather and existential demands that amount to so much nuisance. We perceive two worlds, and it's the world that we think we own, not the world to which we belong, that seems to us real. But our senses deceive us, or if not our senses, then the way we interpret their data has an error in its logic, a flaw in the code, an oversight that warrants a second look, and, if it's found to be inaccurate, immediate correction. For there aren't two worlds, there's one world with infinite attributes, experienced from 7 billion vantage points in a single species, of which there are currently 8 million breathing the air and drinking the water and eating the earth's good food. There is a single life-bearing and life-living planet manifesting herself in the hearts, minds, and creativity of every single creature. There's a single celestial body receiving light from her star and converting it into every heartbeat and whisper, every sensation that plays our delicate bodies like precious instruments, dear to her because we are of her and in her and are her, and have never, even in our wildest fantasies of separation, been anyone else. What's more, we've never committed a single act, save by her giving us the ability, desire, body, mind, life, and will to do it. I would like now to turn our attention not to an equally exhaustive inventory of an opposing tradition, for these are not opposing traditions, but facets of a single tradition called culture from one perspective, called nature coding human creativity from another. I would like to turn our attention toward a vision that may be able to transform our understanding of everything from what life is to who we are, and that may, crucially, be able to heal our relationship with the earth, which is also our relationship with our planetary self. The two directions of this vision, in contrast to those of alienation and domination, I identify as communion and cooperation, that is, a sense of deep and unshakable intimacy with our ecosystem, coupled with an active, evolving responsibility of maintaining ecosystem health. This vision's principle of organization, its basis of comprehension and value, in contrast to an anthropocentric or human outward perspective, is an ecocentric or earth inward perspective, the earth being the source and substance of life, and therefore the primary order of being in which all living organisms participate, and upon whose life-bearing continuity our very existence depends. I would like to set the tone for this vision with a 1914 quote from perhaps our most ecocentric poet, Robinson Jeffers. Quote, "We must uncenter our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and ocean that we were made from." End quote. That there are not one, not two, but three critical implications to this outlook seems to me a measure of Jeffers' genius, which I think he would be quick to dismiss, passing the credit to the genius of the earth herself. First is the injunction to uncenter our minds from ourselves. a clear focus on the importance of unmooring the individualist anthropocentric outlook that has been at the heart of the human enterprise for centuries, if not millennia. The second, and it seems to me subtler directive, is to become confident as the rock and ocean, which can be read confusingly as in a suggestion that we increase our confidence, something we're surely not lacking in, but which I think he meant to suggest as moving past human confidence toward the confidence of that which endures, or the earth herself. The third implication overlaps with the second and runs by so quickly it's all too easy to overlook. The rock and ocean that we were made from. This is both a scientific and animist viewpoint, starkly in contrast with the mythic religious origin stories still commonly accepted as authoritative at the time. From rock came the weathering process that helped establish and regulate the Earth's atmosphere, and from rock, namely limestone, came the mineral for our bones. From the ocean came limestone, came oxygen, came life, including our ancestor, the lobe-finned fish, who became the tetrapod, in particular a five-fingered variety, the only plucky member of its kind to survive the late Devonian mass extinction. How much of this did Jeffers have in mind? It's hard to say, but throughout his life he kept abreast of the science and often worked it into his poems, using its detailed insights to fuel his reverential vision of nature as the essential order to which we belong. As with Einstein, it seemed that Jeffers' pursuit of science led to a religious feeling, a feeling of animism or integral awareness, or, in his words, quote, "I believe that the universe is one being. All its parts are different expressions of the same energy, and they are all in communication with one another, influencing each other, therefore parts of one organic whole. This is physics, I believe, as well as religion." End quote. Jeffers, ever discerning, was careful to point out that his feeling was not an interior conviction. Rather, it was born of the sense that I have fallen in love outward, the ecologist affective stance, full stop. From Jeffers, we move both backwards and forwards in time to take a whirlwind tour of the notions of mind, life, and being as created by our earth or ecological self. We start with Spinoza, who rejected Descartes' dualism and saw that nature and God were properties of the same entity. That God was the inward experience, while nature was the outward experience of the same all-inclusive and all-pervasive existence. And in his view, the same held true for mind and body as the inward-outward experience of the personal self. In other words, he held that there is only one being here, a singularity that expresses itself inwardly through feeling, outwardly through the multiplicity of forms. Amy Leach encapsulates this in the notion, identity must yield to deeper identity. A realization that all forms participate in their larger being and that this inclusiveness of identity occurs at all levels. Our organelles participate in our cells in our organs in our organisms, our organisms within the organizational body of the earth within the galaxy, universe, and all. Any property we think is ours is conferred upon us by the earth, in whose creativity we emerge and in whose processes we evolve. This holds true for even those most inward of qualities, mind, life, and self. As we saw with language, a universal process of communication in which we're bodily immersed, mind is also an enveloping process, a process of cognition. Cognitive science tells us that mental processes are the consequence of a certain complexity that begins long before organisms develop brains and higher nervous systems, and that mind is manifest not only in individual organisms but also in social systems and ecosystems. In other words, mind, like language, like life, is something we grow into, something that's prior to and larger than us. Hence the sense scientists and artists have of studying the mind of nature or God. If that feels counterintuitive to the inward quality we associate with mind, perhaps it's because we don't consider the spatial orientation of inwardness far enough. We are situated within the Earth's process of cognition, as Aristotle saw, conceiving of species as ideas in the mind of the Earth. And whenever I personally walk through an old growth forest and look up into a canopy, I can't help but feel that I'm seeing and bodily experiencing the genius of a mind at work. This inward inclusiveness also holds true for the medium in which mind occurs, life. The integral view of life can be found in holistic traditions stretching back beyond our ability to trace them, but more recently, Chilean biologists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela concluded that its bases are self-generativity and self-maintenance, qualities they termed autopoiesis from the Greek auto meaning self, poiesis meaning making, which also happens to be the Greek root for the word poetry. They and other theorists then added essential properties of cognition or mind and enveloping structure. In other words, they saw life as self-creative, self-sustaining, responsive, immersed in a supportive medium, involved in a system of interchanges that yield transformation or evolution. They saw life as both a process and a system, the simplest instance of which is a living cell. But while the cell is a system with its own internal processes, it is not life system and process unto itself. Biology is an evolution of chemistry, itself an evolution of physics. An organism depends upon a vast array of internal and external movements and conditions in order to develop and experience the world. Organisms emerge within and enjoy life as a component of it, or suffer life as its conditions degrade. Life possesses organisms, not the other way around. In this sense, the Earth is no mere life support system. She's the source and substance of life, in whose mind we have cognition, in whose life we exist as creatures, creatures who endure in her and as her, throughout and beyond our organisms and species, just as a mind survives an idea, and energy survives the body, no matter how seemingly conclusive its end. We live, and we are life itself, and we are being lived by the Earth, who, by encompassing life, transcends it, and is thus more than a living entity, exhibiting a higher level of organization and generativity than life as a whole. It is in this sense that I and other ecological proponents refer to the earth as animate rather than alive. She is alive, is all of life as we know it, but she is also much, much more. She is a planetary being capable of mind within life and life within processes that define her as an ecological entity, and it is through the Earth's being that we have ours. Each of us is simultaneously a person, a family, community, species, life, ecosystem, and planetary existence. Likewise, all the biological, chemical, and physical processes that comprise her singular being where the 14 billion year evolutionary journey that gave rise to our parents gave rise to us and will give rise to countless other species, and where all of our actions, experiences, and their spheres of influence across all points in time, and where all the roles we play in our daily lives, and where all that can be felt and all that can't, and all that gives rise to feeling. Identity no more ends with our person than life ends with an organism. We are every layer of our own identity and the identities we belong to, and we're responsible to those layers as those layers every bit as much as we're responsible to these fleshly pots of human. But how on earth can we hold these various layers of self in mind, let alone act on and endeavor to protect them? Easily. We already do this to some extent without even trying. Individually, we know what it's like to be ourselves. As a species, we know what it's like to be human. As a life form, we know what it's like to be alive. As a planetary constituent, we know what it's like to be the Earth. And as phenomena, we know what it's like to exist. And we maintain this myriad self simply by maintaining our health. But our health is no more confined to our person than our life or self is. Health is distributed and shared within an ecosystem amongst its constituents. The health of the individual depends upon the health of the whole, and if any aspect of the whole is sick, then every aspect of the whole stands in jeopardy. So again, we arrive at the understanding that the earth, the ecosphere, is the primary order of being in whom we're alive, conscious, as healthy or sick as she is. Hers, the underlying identity we share and are. The question arises now, how do we live her? How do we attend to her health? How do we operate as ecological myriad selves? William Stafford encapsulates nearly the whole of ecological thought in 2 lines. The earth says, have a place, be what that place requires. And Wendell Berry, in his work as an artist, farmer, and earthling, heard her requirements in his ecosystem and his person, listening to the terms of her health and our responsibility to maintain it. He heard her and endeavored to turn our lives relentlessly toward her holy work, the work that starts in the self and starts in the home. It starts by the human, quote, waking at home in its creaturely household, which is its work, its burden, its privilege, its intimate reference, its way, end quote. That is, by seeing our home as the first layer of the enveloping body we belong to, and committing to learn its ways and needs, and to attend to it every bit as much as we do to our human selves. The work is a process of familiarization and care, which we begin by paying attention. Barry continually orients us toward the earth, and her works as the basis for ours. We must study endlessly her long, unending work, thus learning to do our own, also unending, making nature our ally so far as we can ask, and she comply. There are 2 important distinctions at play here. One, that the work required of us is as ceaseless as the work that gives rise to us, and 2, that if we work as nature works, learning and employing her methods, then she will be, so far as her creative processes allow, our ally. The unspoken implication of the latter point is that nature moves in ways beyond the providence of a single species. And just as the countless others who came before us subsided into the brief brushstroke of our own, so we will subside into the species our works are preparing. Furthermore, Earth's ability to suffer us has its limits. Our competence to do no permanent wrong to the land is limited by the land's competence to suffer our ignorance, our errors, and to recover, to be made whole. Chances are she will recover. She's seen far worse than us, but she might snuff us out in the process. And who really could blame her? But before that happens, and while we have a chance to restore our competence, we damn well should. The wisdom of holistic homemaking and caretaking has been here all along. Aldo Leopold published his seminal essay Land Ethic in 1949, an eco-manifesto that enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land, arguing that a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. He defines our moral obligations as citizens thus: a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. A millennium and a half earlier, the Confucian text Jiao-qing, or the classic of filial piety, advocated a holistic reverence for and responsibility to take care of one's origin, specifically one's family unit, combined with the Confucian virtue of ren, or benevolent conduct. It set the terms for an ecological ethic. For our origins were understood by various interpreters to extend beyond our nuclear family to our community, our land, our ecosystem, and our heavenly or universal home. Further, our responsibility to ensure the health or integrity of our entire family was bound up in every aspect of our conduct. Indigenous cultures similarly stood in ecological relation to the earth, drawing their nourishment and pleasure from her benevolence, offering thanks and honor in return. The Omaha began the process of familiarization at birth with her initiation ceremony, wherein the child is taken out under the sky and presented to the universe, emphasizing the dual direction of the introduction, child to universe and universe to child. A similar introduction is then made to the earth, her powers, her landscapes, and her living creatures. invoking a covenant between earth and child, mother and offspring, being and organism, to be honored throughout the child's life, filial piety towards its mothers, and the continuation of the mothering instinct in its lifelong conduct. How do we practice the mothering given to us by the earth? By heeding Barry's advice to take care of our home, by attending to health, by practicing gratitude, by communion and cooperation, by maintaining balance. Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is full of practical wisdom on the subject, but it can be boiled down to 3 guidelines. Don't take more than we need, take care of the gifts we receive, and maintain and replenish our sources. Think back to the condition of our lives. They're given not freely, but with an expectation that we'll care for them in the ecosystems through which we arise. If so, we still experience pains and sorrows, but our lives are in the main able to be filled with a sense of belonging, health, and joy. If we don't take care of ourselves, we become sick, aimless, perhaps we even die. And if we don't take care of our ecosystems, then everyone's life becomes impoverished. Creatures disappear from the trees disappear from the riverbanks, and our numbers not all that far down the line. So the role we play in maintaining and not upsetting that balance is our most important responsibility. And one of the surest ways to upset it is by taking too much. Eat too much and we get fat. Buy too much and we get poor. Gut the carbon in the earth and pump it into the atmosphere at a rate exponentially higher than even those at the junctures of the prior mass extinctions and ecosystems suffer, degrade, and collapse. We resolve this by recognizing that we're already immersed in the conversation of ecology. We're mutually supportive organisms and phenomena in an interwoven network of relationships and advantages called symbiosis. And when we go outside, we can speak with the creatures and terrain, our elders in this journey who have far more experience living harmoniously than us. And we can observe the balance of the ecosystem, and we can ensure that we neither take more than we need nor take in a manner that causes harm to the ecosystem's ability to replenish what we take. If we find a patch of berries, we can leave some for the birds who ingest the berries and spread the seeds and fertilize the plants. When we fish or hunt, we can be careful not to overfish or not to hunt the parents of young animals who won't be able to survive without protection and guidance. When we find a faltering ecosystem, we can learn how to help restore it, to plant native species and improve its quality of life. This old wisdom, this resurgent wisdom, in my mind, in my heart, in my read of our potential inspires hope. Maybe the bridges between scientific thinking and religious thinking, and the bridges between philosophy and intuition, and the bridges between earth and organism are appearing like land masses once hidden beneath oceans of ignorance and disregard. And maybe superstition, bias, and logical fallacies are being exposed for the smoke screens, fool's gold, and agents of misdirection that they are. Maybe we're awakening to our ecological connections, even if we had to threaten the connections so deeply that they were forced to send pain signals throughout the nervous system of the earth in order for us to take notice. Maybe we're awakening to the value of our earthly body, taking up the creative challenge of equilibrium, standing in awe at the amazingly complex interplay of contributing factors, getting our hands dirty with reverence at the fact that we get to experience the next step or two along this journey of cosmogenesis. We can do this and we need to. The stakes are high. Either we commune, cooperate, and comply, or we murder, suffer, and die. And communion is our natural state. We're social creatures embedded in an earthly body of language, inheritors of an incredibly vast tradition of life, whose forms emerge through both the flourishing and the collapse of all prior forms, with an estimated 99% of all species in history currently extinct, but having given rise to the ones we know and love, having given rise to ourselves in this enormous and heartbreaking ancestry. And it's okay to make mistakes. The earth makes mistakes. When trees arrived in forest during the mid-Devonian era, they nearly destroyed life. Newcomers to the carbon cycle, they sequestered it much faster than it was replenished by volcanoes. CO2 dropped by more than 90% and the planet froze. There were glaciers in the tropics. In Frost's version of death by ice, the trees wiped out 96% of vertebrates, a devastation even worse than the comet that killed the dinosaurs. That's right, trees are keepers and guides in the Earth's most venerated cycles of living, dying, and regeneration were once the most destructive life forms on this planet, the carbon-guzzling bad boys who ushered in a 100 million-year ice age and nearly sent biology back into chemistry. But the slate wasn't wiped clean, and when eventually the carbon began to even out and the Earth warmed enough to open the life gates, the trees were still here, supplying creatures with plenty of oxygen. They were still here, reshaping the world, but this time they were the cooperative members of a thriving ecosystem, helping the Earth realize the creative potential of forests and all the creatures and stories of love, loss, and joy and despair that could happen therein. Imagine if we could rise to the task of completely reshaping the human endeavor, if we could transform from a predominantly irresponsible, destructive member of the earthly family to a member who lives by the principle of shared health and cares for each aspect of the earth as an aspect of ourself. Imagine if we could shift from an anthropocentric to an ecocentric orientation, revising and revitalizing perception, identity, language, belief, ethics, education, behavior, and law, with impacts to all of our social, cultural, and economic systems. Imagine if we could shift from utilitarianism to cooperative communion, from human as other to human as earth, from self as person to self as all, from ethics by projection to ethics by inclusion, from human language to the language of embodiment, from isolated actions to coordinated movement, from human rights and interests to the rights and interests of the earth and everyone who enjoys its being within her. My wife, ever practical, says to pick one aspect of your life and start from there. Rigorously inventory your habits to see where you can be less consumptive, less wasteful, more grateful, more caring, more aware. When you wash your hands, for instance, use as little water and soap as possible. When you get takeout, bring your own container. Develop a carbon budget. Spend according to it as much as according to your bank account. At first, she says, it can feel like you're being burdened or deprived, but then it can shift to the feeling of facing a challenge, and from there to joy at knowing you're not contributing to the problem, that you're helping to turn the ship around, that you're living a healthful, honorable life in which every decision and action counts. The future looks pretty cloudy from here, dim. Will we survive or won't we? Will our children be thrown back into the dark ages? Will we slaughter a wide swath of life on the planet in order to be lazy fuckers who want to stream our shows, slap some booty, order anything and everything and have it show up in 2 days, glue ourselves to screens until we become artificial hive minds, and above all else, make that money, honey? Trends tell us there's a fair chance, but the trends don't take into account geological timescales, nor do they consider the deeper forces at play in our bodies, hearts, and minds. The operative identity facing this future is the Earth, with billions of years of corrective measures and wisdom at her disposal, even if, in the human mind, the organism is so wrapped up in his individual appearance, he fails to recognize her in himself. The truth is, on the geological timescale, we don't mean much. Pour a glass of beer and we're the top of the foam. Take a sip and we're gone. Even within the Homo genus, we're one of quite a few, and our solo reign accounts for only 1% of Homo's time on the earth. Sapiens as a species or an idea in the Earth's mind is one similar to several others she had, and still others she could have in the future. I don't doubt her ability to think past us, improving upon the idea for a second. And when we open the aperture even further to take in the existential timeline of the Earth, our brief moment in the light diminishes to a speck. Estimates say she has 800 million years of life yet. We're not even halfway into her prime life-bearing range, so to think we're somehow the endpoint of her evolutionary capacities is, frankly, absurd. Far more realistically, we're an interesting idea she has along the way, a mode she tries and explores to its conclusion. And if its conclusion has damaging and far reaching consequences alongside the ones that are brilliant and awe inspiring, how different are we than the volcanoes that cover the planet in lava, miles thick? Or the trees who sucked the carbon down so fast and furious they buried the planet in ice. The Earth's ideas can be far more dramatic and dangerous than ours, and yet, thus far, she has managed to maintain enough pockets of equilibrium that, even when pushed to the breaking point, a few plucky creatures survived, replenishing the process known as life with a host of characters radically different each time, as though they had been given a blank slate and asked to script a new show. Our future could take any number of murky paths. Perhaps in the short term we lean heavily upon our technological prowess and manage to alter the cultural code to the point that so-called artificial intelligence emerges with self-creating and self-sustaining capabilities that make human grasps at survival seem like the activity of a petri dish. Or perhaps, as the Book of Rock has taught us, we're a branch along the tree of life, waving and shedding our leaves, making way for the other branches who, higher up and closer to the crown, will emerge while we wither in their shade, that they may outgrow and outshine us, increasing the tree's beauty, deepening her being. Or, in a last-ditch effort at hope, in a world of nearly impossible truths emerging from brutal scenarios and infinitesimal odds, maybe we figure a way through this. Maybe in the next handful of decades we slash emissions, uncenter our minds, yield to our deeper identities, develop a scientific religious feeling, cultivate gratitude for our countless gifts, assume our familial responsibilities, put our ear to the lips of the earth as we renew our competence in her lifeways, practice filial piety with our entire ecosphere, develop an earth first ethic of health, reorient all our social and economic structures around ecocentrism, introduce our children to the earth as the grandest mother of all, raise them as keepers of her garden, pick up the conversation with our creaturely companions, love everything as ourselves, consult the genius of our places for guidance, and, when we hear the hum in our blood buzzing like the hum in the bees and the hum in the trees, when we hear the earth's holy hymn in us, as us, when we feel ourselves as a nexus of majestic identities nested in hers, we raise a joyful noise in our hearts and our throats, and we sing along. But how amazing would it be if we did more than correct our ways? How amazing would it be if we followed the lead of the trees, outgrew our rebellious, destructive youth, and helped usher in a new era, a radical expansion of life forms and consciousness fueled not by fossil fuels and self-interest, but by communion and cooperation. How amazing would it be if we were to harmonize with the Earth's creativity to become brushes in sync with the creative potential in her hand? If we became symbiotic catalysts in her autopoiesis and helped her shape the poem in which there are many creatures like us, a rich spectrum of deeply sensitive, discerning, artistic species, each of us enjoying her health and helping it flourish, each of us enriching her intelligence and experience, each of us deepening her intimacy and identity, each of us eager to play our roles within this majestic show, the star of which we all belong to, the star of which is, as ecology has taught us, as love has taught us, as the earth has taught us, every single part of her show.